I'm the IWM specialist for the Resource Conservation District that works out of the Victorville Service Center for the Department of Agriculture in Victorville. So I'm just here today to kind of go over about what NRCS and RCD is, what we do, kind of how I got to the point where I got to, and actually what I do job-wise out in the environment and actually helping farmers to increase their production and kind of conserve water and different things like that. So go ahead and flip to, there we go. So how did NRCS, RCD even come about? We've been around, actually, it's kind of interesting because our local RCD office has been here in Victorville since '51. So it's been here a long time. But basically NRCS, which is the National Resource Conservation Service, they were founded as a direct result of the Dust Bowl era, which I don't know how many of you guys pay attention in history class, but during the Great Depression, there was severe mismanagement of our topsoils, and combined with drought led to the loss of our most rich topsoils where we grow most of our produce at in the Midwest. And it created these huge dust storms. And so they had to combat that. Next slide. And so it was kind of cool because back in those times, FDR, who was one of our presidents, President Roosevelt, he was very active in conservation, and he approached Congress and they passed the Soil Conservation Act in 1935. And that basically set up the structure for what we call now NRCS. Originally, it was called the National Soil Conservation Service. And then the RCDs used to be called Soil Conservation Districts. And so basically, this was a little excerpt. It's not that important, but it was actually taken out of a newspaper at the time. And it just kind of showed the devastation. Approximately 35 million acres of formerly cultivated land had basically been destroyed. They were in the process of losing 100 million acres, had lost all or most of their topsoil, and then another 125 million acres were rapidly depleting their topsoil. So it was a huge issue. And, our breadbasket, especially then, we needed it because international trade, the world economies, they just weren't what they are today. Technologies weren't there. So it was a huge deal. Next slide. So basically, that formed NRCS, Soil Conservation District. But right after they formed it, they realized there's a problem. And one of the problems is, and you guys probably know this also, is people in Washington don't always know what we need here in Victorville. They might have an idea, but they don't actually know. And so they came up with the idea, and FDR just wrote a letter to the 48 governors at the time. So for extra credit, what are the other two states that came after 1935? Alaska and Hawaii, very good. But he just got out his pen and he wrote to the 48 states and said, hey, you guys need to make some local soil conservation districts. And they were all on board. And California in 1940 passed Division 9 of the Public Resources Code that designated RCDs as a special district and gave them basically how they operate and what their charges are, what their responsibilities. And we actually have a board. Neville's one of our board members. And, they sit around kind of like what the school board does here, and they develop, policy, and they run the RCD. And we have things, a lot of active projects that we take part in. So basically the RCDs, they used to be soil conservation districts. It started as a bunch of farmers, old codgers sitting around in an area coming up with, well, what works? What's working here? And then that evolved into the boards and to basically what we have now. Next slide. So what does the Mojave Desert RCD do? We kind of do a little bit of everything, and that's probably the coolest component of my job is I just don't do water conservation. Of course, water conservation is at the top because that's what I do, but we also do erosion control. which is water and wind. So especially after wildfires, we have huge erosion issues up in the local mountains. So we actually have a program down here, which is under the wildfire restoration called Relief, and they help to replant and stabilize hillsides. We get involved with, RCDs also get involved with wind erosion, planting windbreaks, and hedgerows don't so much, but certain ones do. Hedgerows and windbreaks help with wind erosion. Invasive weed control and invasive species control is one of a huge project we do. I forgot the number, but we've removed a lot of acreage of salt cedar tamarisk, Russian olive, arundo through the Mojave Riverbed. And basically, those have no beneficial aspects in our riparian areas down there. They use a lot of water, especially the salt cedar. They outcompete the local native vegetation. So we've helped remove a lot of that stuff. So we're involved in that. Stream channel stabilization and water quality. That ties right into the riparian area, the Mojave Riverbed, just kind of restoring it, try to restore it back to its natural habitat. The proper range management on both private and federal leased lands. We get involved with helping. We don't have a whole lot of grazing out here, but we do. We have a customer that just came on board, and he's right smack dab in the middle of the Mojave Preserve out there, kind of near Essex. He's literally out in the middle of the desert, but they graze. Our deserts were grazed a lot out here, and they still can be with the right management. And then the wildfire restoration, the Relief, we have a very active Relief coordinator up in Big Bear. So the next slide will show you our district area, but basically this side of the mountain is ours, and then the other side is the other RCD down the hill. But we have a huge service area, but our Relief has been very active. Basically, Santa's Village got destroyed a few years back in a wildfire, and our Relief coordinator went in there with forestry and some other of our sister agencies, and they restored a lot of it and stabilized it. They've opened up campgrounds again, and actually they reopened Santa's Village. So, there's a lot of good things that we do. Also, community outreach and education is huge. I don't know how many of you went to, I held a workshop here down in the ag department a few months ago, and it was a good turnout, and it was really positive, good feedback, and we want to do more of those. So we're always doing workshops and outreach, kind of like what I'm doing today. Next slide. So established in 1951, our RCD is right here, and it's 17,000 square miles. So myself, I'm the IWM specialist, and Luis is my IWM intern, and he's a student here. It's us for 17,000 square miles, and that's it. So we drive out to Needles a lot. We drive out, to the Cadiz area, Amboy. It was kind of cool. I did a little thing so you could fit Delaware, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and still have some extra room just in our service area. Agriculture is actually pretty large in San Bernardino County. It's dwindled a little bit compared to its heyday back in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even before that. With all the people moving up here, you can see the fallowed alfalfa fields, but it's still like out in Newberry Springs, there's a lot of pistachio and alfalfa. Needles area, there's a lot of alfalfa, wheat, rice, different things. Pistachio, almonds, olives. There's a lot of ag up here. And so there's actually a lot of job opportunity in ag if you pursue it. One of our big voids, kind of off topic, but so we work with farmers with NRCS, and they can get access to Farm Bill cost share money, and basically they can get their irrigation systems replaced, and they do kind of a cost share. One of our voids is we don't have any small scale ag designers. We have to get people to come down from like Bakersfield or Fresno area to plan out a 5 to 10 acre farm. So there's kind of a niche market right now. Is these people have to wait for one of our engineers or someone through the agency that can design for them, and they're backed up, a year and a half to get those designs done. So it's like there's little niches in ag. All the farm managers I work with, the professional farmers, all their farm managers, they went to college, because you have to understand agronomy, you have to understand soils, you have to understand, how things are going to affect the plant growth and how to maximize crop production. Because when you have a 160 acre farm, you have to run it properly or you're going to lose a lot of money. So next slide. And that other one was just all the other RCDs. But anyway, so let's get on water conservation. So IWM. So what is IWM? It's irrigation water management. Basically, it's very simple. I help farmers save water. And so, we do that by incorporating new technologies. Here's some of the technologies that we push. Drip irrigation. Yeah, definitely. I'm going to pass all this stuff around. So this is just an example of different types of drip. So the ones that look like flags on them, those are flag emitters. And then the kind of round ones, those are called PC emitters, pressure compensating. And there's pros and cons to both. This one right here, this is made by Netafim. They're an Israeli company. Israel is leaps and bounds ahead of us in water conservation. And this is kind of like the Cadillac of ag. It's a little more expensive, but... What's the company called? Netafim. And so, it's like anything, right? You get what you pay for. If you go to Home Depot and get the off-brand irrigation stuff, if you can get a couple years out of it, you're doing pretty good. So definitely, I go to conferences a lot, and I try to stay ahead of the new technology coming out. There's some really great innovative stuff I've seen. Hopefully, it'll catch on. PG&E right now, I don't know if you guys have gone out there yet, but I think you're going to. They have a new drag drip system, which is basically a big pivot. I got pictures of pivots I'll point out. And they basically drag kind of a soaker hose behind it. And it's kind of a simple idea, but it saves a lot of water. So it's all about staying ahead of the game. Another part of what I do is good soil management. Because without soil, you can't grow anything. And it all comes down to, what are your practices? How are you farming? And what kind of things are you doing to make sure that it's a sustainable practice? And I'm sure you've heard the word sustainability a lot, so it'll come up a few times. So typically, we see this a lot. This is an orchard. Those are ume plums. So typically, Dad did it, Grandpa did it. We just fill up the water well. That's how people like to water, but that's not always the best way to water, especially up here. Because I don't know if you can see, there's kind of a ring around there. It's white. Did you say something? What's the matter? Do you have a question, Jennifer?
No.
Okay.
I was just saying what it was.
So what that is that's from water evaporating. And up here in the desert, when water evaporates, and in a lot of other areas, depending on how you're fertilizing it, it'll leave behind salts. And that's basically a salt ring. You can walk up to it, and you can dab it with your finger and taste it, and it's salty. And you'll see that on, 1,500 plants. And a lot of that can be avoided through some different practices, which I'll go over, which is using drip and mulching. But up in the top corner, that was actually taken out on one of the Indian reservations we work with. And they're in the middle of the desert, and they're still flood irrigating. But we've actually gotten a lot of pivots put in there. And since the new pivots have gone in, they've already saved 5,000 acre feet of water, which is a lot of water. So, it's all about, understanding the needs of the customer. understanding the technologies and what can kind of fit into their budget. Next slide. So our current water crisis has led to an increase on water conservation. They passed laws, there's taxes, there's all these things going on. I'm sure you guys have noticed, those of you that pay electricity and water, that your rates have gone up. That's all part of the conservation model. You know, California is a hydraulic society. And at any time when I'm talking, if you guys have questions, just raise your hand and throw them out. I have no problem answering things on the fly. But so when I say California is a hydraulic society, what does that mean to you guys? I don't know if you guys have talked about this at all in a little bit. You've read about it. Hopefully they read about it. So most of California's water is moved. So a lot of our water starts up north in the Central Valley and is pumped around the state where they need it. So about 23 million people just down the hill, they depend on water from other areas. It's all pumped. It takes electricity, it takes aqueduct systems to move this water around. So when there's a drought in the state, and if there's a drought up north, it'll affect us down here. You know, water in Southern California travels through thousands of miles of aqueduct systems and piping to get it to where it needs to go. You know, despite the rainfall in Northern California, some of the reservoirs are still below historical levels. Right now, a lot of the reservoirs are up because of our current storms, but how long that'll last is the question. And when you have a depleted aquifers over a long period of time, it takes a lot of those storm events to actually replenish the groundwater. And we're kind of blessed up here because, you know, we're pretty much all groundwater up here. They don't take a whole lot of water out of the state water project. They do recharge, but most of everything that you get out of your tap is all from the ground. It's not like that in other parts of California. It's all comes right out of the aqueduct and they pay a lot of money for it. Can you kick it over to the next slide? So I'll run through these kind of quickly, but this is just kind of an idea of reservoir conditions, and this was back in October of 2016. It's a really cool website. I think it's called californiawaterblog.org, and they update once a month reservoirs, rain patterns, and you can really kind of take a look at what's going on in the state. So these are some of the reservoirs. Some are full, above historical levels, some are below. Like St. Louis Reservoir is down, New Minones is down, and then some of the other ones are way down below historic levels. So why do we care about that? Well, we all go to the grocery store, and California supplies, it's the world's breadbasket. The ag that takes place in the Central Valley, all that stuff affects what we pay when we go buy some tomatoes, unless you grow your own tomatoes or you know you hit the local farmers market. But you know all that stuff affects. So when there's water crisis at different parts of the state, there's a trickle down effect on that. Go to the next slide. So this is just some more. This is precipitation levels of last October, kind of up in Northern California, and you can see that. You know, it's not, you know, the average, and then what the daily precipitation was is a little below the average. Next slide. And then same thing, and just, you can flip through those. Basically, what these slides are showing is it's showing a trend that as we move south, there's less water. It gets drier. And that's something that we have to worry about because we're in Southern California and we're located in a desert. So go to the next slide. So
real quick guys, what happened this year that is going to make our water infrastructure hold less water even though we have the wettest winter on record in Northern California?
The dam that broke?
Not just the dam, the dams, all the dams that have to be repaired and all the levees. We have $1 billion bill now. Guess who's going to pay for it?
And actually, just to piggyback, last year I was up in around Fresno area. I went up to Cal Poly and I took some satellite classes, and we were on a bunch of the almond farms. And an almond farmer had to fork out $600,000 to put in a new well. And he had to drop that well down 2,400 feet to get water. And the reason why is because they've depleted their higher ground level out of their aquifer. And what's happened is it's collapsed because they depleted it. So now that water reservoir is gone. That aquifer is destroyed because once it collapses, it's done. And they've actually had areas in the Central Valley it's actually sinking. Some areas it's a few inches, some areas it's more drastic because they've taken that water out and it's just basically collapsed down. And those are the things that you may think, oh, well, it's no big deal to have reservoirs. Well, yeah, but if they fail or if there's, we have a major drought comes through, that all affects things. So, groundwater storage is really important. Okay, off that squirrel trail. So the data shows as we move south, there's less rainfall. The Mojave Desert area, we're still in a drought condition, extreme drought condition. So what can farmers do to be able to grow and provide a vital service? Because we need food. But, things grow down here in the desert really well. Pistachios grow down really well down here. Alfalfa, they love alfalfa down here. And there's reasons for that. The heat, alfalfa, when you cut it, you kind of have to let it lay out a little bit and dry before you bale it. Well, if you're in a rainy area, that's going to take more time. If you're out in the desert, you can get that done a lot quicker. And you can get extra cuttings. Your growing season is typically a little bit longer down here. So ag is going to stay. The question is, how do we make it efficient? And how do we convince them? Next slide. So irrigation water management, we provide technical assistance and help the farmers to help them save water. So we go out there, we evaluate their farm, and we kind of give them suggestions on how they can better approve what they're doing. The process involves proper scheduling, updating the system to the industry's best standards at the time, and practices and new technologies. But, as with everything costs money. So, there's kind of this little dance that you have to do with farmers sometimes. But the important part of IWM, it's kind of what I call the IWM trifecta, is you have to understand your plants, you have to understand your soil, and then you can understand the water relationship. Because if you don't understand any one of those, it's not going to work. If you don't know your soils, you're not going to be able to schedule properly. If you don't understand what you're watering, as far as plant-wise, every plant uses a different amount of water. And one of the most common things I see up here is overwatering. I went to a farm a few months ago, and they called me out, and they're like, oh, our trees are droopy, they're dying. They're not getting enough water. And I'm like, so I walk out there and I look, and this is a soil probe. It's a soil auger probe. And so, it has a catch can. It's really cool because you can dig it in the ground, and then you can actually pull the soil out and take a look at it. So I buried this to the handle, to the top of the ground, and every 18 inches I emptied out the catch. And when I got down 5 feet, which is way under the root zone of the tree, I could literally take the water and squeeze it out of the soil. It was totally saturated. And that's actually pretty common. I see people do that a lot. But you have to understand that plants are like people. We need water, we need food, and we need air. And plants need air above the soil, and they need it in the soil. So when you overwater, there's no air for the roots to allow those exchanges to happen, and they literally drown. And so, you have to make sure that you understand these relationships and understand what soil you're working with. So when I was going to school, did I just take water classes? No. I took horticulture classes, I took soil classes, I took a couple different soil classes, just to be able to have something extra in my toolbox when I go out there. Next slide. So I'm sure you guys have never seen this before, right? Okay, good. So water conservation in ag only works if it's sustainable. How am I doing on time?
You are doing good.
All right, perfect. So, you know, a lot of people look at this and they're like, well, what is that? Well, you know, it's the sustainability model. If I go out to a farmer and I tell him, hey, you know what, you're wasting water, it's no good, you need to change. You know, he's going to tell me one of two things, either get the heck out of here or, well, what do you mean I need to change? So I kind of need to sell that. Part of my job is I'm a salesman. And the easiest way for me to sell better products to the farmer, better sustainable practices, is using this model. Is I have to convince him that, you know, he has a responsibility to his local environment, the watershed. He also has a responsibility to his pocketbook. Because anything with water equals money. You know, water, even if you have water rights, you have to pay money to pump it out of the ground. And depending on how deep your well is, that can get real pricey. And right now, it's really expensive for farmers to use electricity. They have only certain times a day they can pump. Otherwise, they're going to get hit with a huge electricity bill. So if I can annotate savings, like, hey, you know, if you upgrade to, you know, drip, it's going to save you X amount of water, which is going to save you X amount of kilowatt hours. And I literally do a math problem right in front of them. Okay, how much do you pay per kilowatt hour? This is what you're going to save. And then they can register that as, oh, wow, you know, I can save money over, and this can actually pay for itself. Or the other thing is I have to be really careful because I want to look at the environmental part. I want to save water. But if I do a conservation practice that affects his crop production, he's going to go right back to his old bad habits. So you have to find that balance between conservation and production. And it's a little different in ag because when you take water conservation classes for, you know, ornamentals around your house, you're basically watering just to keep it green. But in agriculture, you're watering it for crop production. And a lot of plants can survive on real little water, but you're not going to have any crop production. And that's where you kind of have to find that happy medium, that happy marriage between everything. And that's where sustainability comes in, is, you know, you have to understand these things and just have a conversation with them and kind of help them help themselves in a lot of ways. Next slide. So, okay, this is one thing that really just irritates me to no end. So, soil management. So, you know, it's critical to crop irrigation. How you manage your soils, what you did to your soil before you even planted. So traditional farming techniques, and people do that up here even when they're not farmers, they just grade the heck out of everything. Let's just, you know, get our tractor out there and let's make the ground totally smooth. Well, you know, grading destroys all your soil structure and it removes that top layer of organic matter in your soil, and it destroys anything organic living on the top. So then you can never replenish what little organic matter we have up here. This is real typical. People buy 10 acres, they grade all 10 acres, whether or not they're planting or not. And that just kind of destroys, you know, any future production on that land, because now you're going to have to really amend that soil to get it to grow anything. It also causes, you know, these crazy dust storms up here. When you drive around, you see the wind blowing. A lot of that goes right back to, you know, people grading. If you ever drive down Phelan Road and you drive by a house that has a graded lot, you can see the sand just blowing right over in front of that thing because there's nothing to hold it down. A lot of people think our native vegetation are weeds. They're not. Although we do have a lot of weeds, but they're not weeds. They're actual plants that thrive in this habitat, and they do a really good job at holding down the topsoil. And, you know, you should leave them there as much as you can. We work with educating people on no grade. You know, you don't have to grade everything. Right now we're trying to educate cities up here on these policies because there's a certain city, I'm not going to mention their name, but they've basically authorized, even if, they'll look at your property and if it looks dead, they're going to tell you to remove it or they're going to remove it for you. But a lot of times what's dead is a desert native. And we've had discussions with them, well, can you tell us the difference between a dormant and a dead native? And they can't, because it's very hard to tell the difference unless you know what you're looking for. And a lot of people are like, oh man, that bush is dead, and chop it down. But if you just leave that bush there, as soon as a little moisture comes, it'll perk right up. So, there's a lot of education that goes on with this. It's kind of a battle. It goes back to that sustainability model of fire departments love to see this because there's nothing to burn. But as far as the soil management practice goes, it's horrible. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is actually, these are pictures I took. Most of them are, but this was a guy that was going to get into farming. And he goes, hey, I have this wash through my backyard. What can I do? And so I showed up. I said, well, what do you plan on doing? He goes, well, I'm going to grade it all. And I'm like, well, first of all, you can't because it's a wash. And secondly, you want to try to keep a lot of these bushes on there as you can because a lot of them attract natural pollinators. And well, he didn't listen. So I came out there 2 months later and that's what he'd done to his property. So he graded, filled in this reservoir, and then guess what happened? The rain came. And guess what happened to his neighbor's house? The rain went into his neighbor's house. So guess who has to pay to fix his neighbor's house? He does. It's actually illegal to change any type of natural water movement, waterways. There's some new legislation that's come on board in the last year that governs that stuff. So anytime there's a natural waterway, which you can tell, that's, you can actually see that on Google Maps going through his property. You really want to be careful before you change things like that. But then again, people, and it was funny because when I told him, I said, you can't do this stuff. And he goes, well, why not? I said, well, there's laws. And he kind of shrugged his shoulders. Well, now he's having to shrug when he pulls out his checkbook and write those checks for those repair bills. But, really, that's what we're here for is, when people have questions, we can come out there and kind of guide them in the direction they need to go. And we have access to all these experts. In our office with NRCS, we have soil scientists, we have agronomists, we have GIS specialists, we have all these people just sitting there waiting for something to do. Yes?
When you run across some of those new customers, what's a percentage of them not wanting to listen?
It depends. If it's, the first thing is how much is it going to cost? And then the second thing is a lot of them, it's not so much their fault, it's just a bad habit is, we learn from our parents, we learn from other people we know, and a lot of them don't really know any better because, well, my neighbor down the road's been doing this for 20 years, so I'm going to do it too. And it's just breaking into that kind of that hard-headedness of there is a better way to do it, and this is why. But I'd say most of them, a lot of them, typically what happens is a lot of times they won't listen, and then about a year or two later, they call you up. And they're like, can you come out and take a look? Things aren't working the way we thought they would. And well, now we've got them because, they've proven for us our point. They failed, now they need help. We never like to see people do that because it wastes a lot of resources, but if that's what it takes for them to understand, then that's what it takes. But, that's why we're hoping to do more workshops because we have a lot of niche communities up here that grow kind of a niche crop, jujubes and umes. And they're very kind of, they're a small community and they're very interpersonal. So they kind of stay within their own group and they don't really expand out of their bubble very often. But we're starting to break through to some of them on good farming techniques. A lot of them are customers now. But there's, a lot of them will show up and they argue with you. And I'm like, well, why'd you become a farmer? Well, I retired. Well, what'd you retire from? Oh, I was a lawyer. I was a doctor, but you've never farmed. Well, no, but just listen. And, then a lot of times they'll go through and then they'll come back. But, it's just a process like anything else. Next slide. So, why not clear the land? Well, it destroys soil structure. And soil structure is probably one of the hardest things to get back once it's gone. It's like trying to put toothpaste back in a toothpaste container. It's impossible. It takes a lot of work, takes a lot of money. It's better not to destroy it and just, start off with a good structure. It promotes invasive species. If you ever look at a field and there's stuff growing on it and then they go build a house and they grade that field, what pops in there right away? All these weeds. And most of them are invasive. It also increases wind and water erosion. If you ever want to talk about invasive species, just talk to Carlos. He loves those things. All day long. So this is something right here. This is a practice that drives me through the wall. People will grade, and then they'll put 18 inches to 2 feet of mulch on top. And the mulch they're getting it's total crud. A lot of it's coming from companies that are in waste removal. They can no longer put like the green and brown waste in the landfills, so they mulch it. Well, the problem is a lot of it's curbside, so there's plastics, there's contraceptives, there's all these things that are like, I'll walk out on these farms and there's just all this stuff out there. And I'm like, you're gonna grow in this? There's hypodermic needles in here, there's all this stuff. I mean, literally, it's gross. There's diapers, there's just all this stuff. But, for some reason, they've been convinced that, this is the way to do it. And that comes back to the education, because there's a huge disconnect. Because I'll look at people and they'll be like, oh, that's compost. I'm like, no, that's not compost, that's mulch. Yes, it's very bad unless you know how to use it properly. Mulch is very beneficial when it's applied properly. But what people forget is that mulch, all its main reason is it's an insulator. It lowers your soil temperatures. It creates a barrier to slow down evaporation. There's typically very little nutrients in mulch. And if you incorporate mulch into your soil like this without a good nutrient plan, you're going to throw off all your ratios, your carbon-nitrogen ratios and everything else. Because once the little microorganisms start waking up, they want to eat that stuff. Then they're going to pull the nutrients from the plants to do it. So you have to make sure that, before you do a huge practice like this, that you consult somebody and that we can kind of talk you through it. Next slide. So, some of the best ways to increase water savings is good soil practices. So organic matter is awesome for water holding capacity. You add a little bit of organic matter into your soil, it increases how much water you can hold in that soil. And there's different techniques you can use instead of just grading everything. So I'm going to kind of go over some of these really quick. So next slide. So there's terracing, which this was a very hilly area that, they probably would have had a lot of runoff, but they terraced it. So now there's these little levels. And you'll see a lot of this if you ever take a tour, if you want to score brownie points with your significant other, go on a wineries tour through like the Napa Valley or even Temecula, and you'll see things like this, where they've got mountains and hillsides and they're growing right on them. Next slide. Contour farming. Again, it's kind of like terracing. I can't talk today. Terracing. But it's following the natural contour of the land. Instead of it being terraced, it's just following the natural grades and the natural slopes. Next slide. Strip cropping. If you guys ever do IPM, they'll probably talk about this a little bit. Did you guys talk about this?
They would have read about it.
Well, hopefully you read about it and you weren't watching Netflix all night. So, you can buddy plant, right? Plant different crops together. And this not only helps with like pest management, it also helps with your nutrient cycling, because different plants, like if you plant legumes, they'll put some of that nitrogen back into the soil. It also adds, when you plant like the hay back there, which is kind of like a pasture area, it adds a lot of organic matter right back into the soil. Some of our richest farmlands are what used to be grasslands, prairies. There's a ton of organic matter when you incorporate grasses because of their root structures. They run long, they run deep, and they just put that stuff right back in. Next slide. Cover crops. Again, I love cover crops. I actually think they have a place up here, and you can do them and conserve water. We have a lot of natural grasses that are indigenous to our area that use very little water. But again, you're going to preserve the topsoil by throwing a cover crop down, because it's going to hold it down. Then you're also going to incorporate some nutrients back in there and some organic matter. And you'll preserve, by planting a cover crop, you'll preserve some of the microorganisms that are left over. Because up here, typically, if you don't put anything down, it's going to dry out super quick. And a lot of those microorganisms you're going to lose. So, it's important that, you can do things like this and still save water if you use the right farming techniques. Next slide. Agroforestry and windbreaks. Huge, especially up here where the wind always blows. Windbreaks are great for slowing down wind erosion. And actually, we create sand barriers in some of our windy areas, like out in Newberry Springs, Lancaster, where they have these huge sand blows. You can plant a windbreak, and it'll actually stop the sand from covering your crop. And then you can also plant in between, with the agroforestry, in between the trees. And then you've got windbreaks, you've got shading if you have a crop that maybe doesn't need sunlight all day. There's a lot of beneficial uses. We don't see too much agroforestry up here because obviously, our biggest trees are Joshua trees and creosote. But next one. Mulching. Mulching, I love mulching because when it's done properly, it saves a lot of water and it cuts down on weed growth. But remember, mulch isn't just wood chips. Mulch can be plastics. It can be recycled materials. My thing when I talk to people is whatever you're putting down there, it's going to be there a while. So make sure what you're putting down there is okay, that you want to stare at it for, 10 or 15 years. Always check out your mulch and your compost before you get it. By law, they have to give you a printout of what's in it, especially the compost. So you can ask them for a readout. They have to send it to a lab. So you can actually see what the nutrient makeup is. Are there any hard metals in there? And things like that. So you actually know what you're putting on your property. Excuse me. Next slide. Composting. So, composting, it's definitely something that everybody can do. It doesn't have to be super expensive. You don't have to go buy those fancy barrels you see at Home Depot. You can throw up a very simple structure like this with the rabbit fence stuff, and throw your yard clippings, your leftovers from your veggie leftovers, things like that from the kitchen scraps, and compost. And you can compost a lot of things that you may not think you can compost. If you look in that barrel, it looks like there's a container in there, but that's actually a cornstarch container that breaks down. So you can compost that. You throw it in there, water gets in there, a little heat, all that stuff starts to break down. But compost is a great alternative to fertilizers. man-made fertilizers. Fertilizers, they do their job and they're cheap, but they're very hard on the environment to produce. But they're so cheap. You can go to Walmart and buy a bag of fertilizer, where it might take you 6 to 8 weeks to get your compost going. But you kind of have to balance those things, and that's where good planning and just a good understanding of what you want to do will help you in the long run. Next slide. So irrigation savings starts with an understanding of a few basic things. So before you can even schedule, you need to understand, your plant, right? The plant uptake rate. Every plant uses a different amount of water. So a Joshua tree is going to use a different amount of water than, say, a cottonwood, right? Soil. So what's your growth medium? There's some really cool websites, and our office actually runs one of them. There's Web Soil Survey, and there's Soil Web. And you can actually download the app right on your phone, and you can hit go to my location, and wherever you're standing, it'll tell you exactly what the makeup of that soil is. And there's two of them. There's Soil Web, and there's Web Soil Survey. Soil Web, you can Google it. It's run through UC Davis, but all the data collected comes from the same place, which is NRCS. We have a whole department in our office that's dedicated to soil survey. They drive around literally all over the desert, and they dig holes and they analyze the soil. And so all that is available to you. So you can kind of look, okay, what's my soil made up of? What's the 3 basic components in soil? Sand, silt, and clay. And understanding that relationship, in that packet I gave you, there's kind of the triangle, and then also in that trifold handout with the texture by feel method. Different soils, they do different things with water. Water moves through them differently. They compact differently. So it's good to understand that stuff. Your climate is also a huge thing you need to understand. Things are going to grow different, and you're going to water different here in the desert than you do up outside of San Francisco. So there's something called CMIS. It's the California Irrigation Management Information System. We have a CMIS station here at the college. It collects data and historical data on evaporation rates, wind speed, temperatures, soil temperature. All that stuff is there for you to use. So when you actually do an irrigation schedule, you plug all that in, and then you come out with your maximum, outcome. A very, very simple, way to think about it is, if I have a tree that needs 12 inches of water a year, and I have a ETO evaporation rate of 9 inches in my area, how much am I going to have to water? You're going to have to basically add 9 inches onto that 12 in order to compensate for your environmental factors and your plant factors. Because, like we talked about before, plants breathe. When we breathe, we give off moisture. Plants do too. And in the desert, our desert plants are adapted, but when you bring in crops that aren't adapted to a desert environment, you have to take all that into consideration. So once you understand this relationship, you can create a good irrigation plan. How's time?
You have exactly
10 minutes? All right. So next slide. So some of the things I look at is, how is a producer irrigating? What their current practices are. Are they just flooding it, filling up the well? Do they have drip? Are things installed properly? These are things. I use this. This is basically a double ring, and you do percolation tests with it. And it'll tell you how many inches an hour the soil can take in. It's good to know that, because if I have a heavy clay soil that can only take in a 1/2 inch an hour, then I'm not going to put on a 3 gallon per hour emitter, or it's going to flood. So those are things that you have to kind of take into. Next slide. So here again, these are bad irrigation practices. They're just filling the well up. You can see the salts building up around this well from the evaporation. Next slide. So, standing water in our area, it equals water loss. It's bad. It's important to know what your soil infiltration rate is, how much water can go into the soil. And then also your water quality plays a role. Depending on if you have a saline, your water's saline, if it's salty, depending on what's going on with it, the chemistry, the pH, that also affects how it's going to function inside the soil. Next slide. So best irrigation technologies are micro drip. I kind of passed those around earlier. Subsurface drip, which looks something like this. Basically, you have a tube with some holes in it. It's got emitters built in. Now this is subsurface. These emitters are coated with special coatings to stop the roots from intruding into the emitters. They do have inline emitters for the top, for the surface, but you don't want to bury those because they're not treated, and in a matter of probably about a year or two, they're going to be full of roots. But subsurface, we're actually doing a study right now. We're installing one in pasture land, but one of our big pistachio farmers did subsurface drip, and it's working out really well. He doesn't have to mulch because he's got 8 inches of soil acting as an insulation barrier. He has no weeds out there because there's no water on the top for the weeds to grow. And his trees are super healthy because when he fertilizes, he uses liquid fertilizers that are organic, and they go directly to the root system instead of just throwing it on top and having it volatilize. Because up here in the heat, fertilizers, things like that will volatilize very rapidly. And then LIPA systems, which I'll show you on, I think on the next slide or a couple slides after. LIPA is right here. And hey, look, it's Luis. He's right back there. So here's a LIPA system. That's basically the big pivot. So instead of irrigating like this or like this with the sprinklers on the wheels or the hand lines, you use these special nozzles that are low to the ground. They have bigger droplets of water, so it slows down evaporation rates. Next slide. Here's some pictures of drip. Here's some surface drip, inline, and some more of the different types of drip emitters. Next slide. So agriculture and water conservation can coexist. In fact, it's going to have to coexist in order for it to survive and to keep our prices down. Education and a willingness to participate is a must. If a lot of these farmers are going to stay in business, they're going to have to modify how they irrigate and what kind of soil practices that they use. Water savings, is directly connected to energy savings and lower carbon emissions. The less water we pump, the less fossil fuels we burn to move that water. A lot of farmers still use generators, diesel generators, to pump water. They fire up the generator, they pump their water. So as we increase water savings, we'll lower how much electricity we use. Next slide. I think it's almost over. And yeah, it is over. So are there any questions about anything? Yes?
Do you have any involvement with the Lake Owens waterbed project?
No, we don't. That's out of our service area. So there are other RCDs up there that do that stuff, but we primarily go from basically this side of the mountains to both state lines.
Is it like county?
Yeah, so it's by county, but San Bernardino County is the largest county, and we have the largest area within that county, so it's huge.
How do you get to be an intern?
So to become an intern, you have to know how I like my coffee. That's very important. No, basically, we have something through NRCS called Earth Team Volunteers, and you can call. I think you can either like email Carlos or Neville and get the information. We do have information pamphlets in the classrooms here, and basically you just sign up. Luis, I'll pick on him a little bit. He started about a year and a half ago as an Earth Team volunteer, and then we got some extra money, so I brought him on as an IWM intern. So, you can kind of work yourself up. Depending on how money goes, sometimes we can pay our interns, sometimes we don't. But it's really good opportunity because no other place are you going to be able to do what we do without at least being in a graduate program. He'll go back there and he'll work in our soils lab. It's a full functioning soils lab. We'll do water quality testing. A lot of that stuff you're not going to get exposed to until you're in a 4-year university, but just volunteering down there, you're going to get exposure to it. Also, if you're kind of wondering what the heck am I going to be doing in 10 years, it's a good place to go and see, do I like soil? Do I like water? Do I like agronomy? What kind of things do I like in this field? And kind of just, experiment, go out in the field. Do I like being out in the field? Do I like to be in the office? There's a ton of different jobs that are offered. And NRCS has a really cool program called the Pathways Program. You actually apply for it like a job through USGov or usjobs.gov. And once you're in college and you have a major that coincides with natural sciences, you can apply. As long as it's a 4-year program, you can apply and they'll bring you on for 2 years. And you work the summers in one of the NRCS offices or a BLM office. And once you complete the 2-year program, you're guaranteed a position somewhere in NRCS. Now, you might be sent anywhere in the country, but you're guaranteed a position, which is phenomenal because a lot of places don't guarantee you a position. And they pay you and they pay for your housing if you get sent to Texas or Nebraska or Wisconsin or Alaska or somewhere. So it's really cool. With NRCS, if you can land a job within them, you can laterally transfer to other jobs anywhere in the country if there's an opening. So, there's a lot of benefit to it. And if you're actually, I'm sure your teachers will attest to this, it's very rare that you go to college, get a degree, and actually work in that field. A lot of people go to college and they don't even work in that field.
And real quick, before we end, remember this is a vocation, or like this class is a vocational class. So vocational education is education to get you jobs without having to have a degree. So for example, you don't have to go to the 4-year university to get a horticulture plant soil science degree like I have. You could go here and get certificates and do vocation. Those are jobs that don't need those degrees. And ag, natural resources.
Thank you very much.
The biggest field outside of housing.
So my job in the private sector with just the certifications from IA and from like AWWA, it'll start around $24 an hour. So, and that's just certification. That's not bad money for not having any type of college degree. So you can actually, you can find those jobs. They're easier to find in big farming areas. And there's specialists for soil. There's specialists. Farm managers are huge. If you know what you're talking about, those farm managers on a big farm, they'll make $60,000, $70,000 a year if they know what they're doing. They make really good money. So, it's all in what you want to do. And vocation, the nice thing about vocation is if it doesn't work, you've only wasted hardly any money and you haven't wasted a whole lot of time. We're done. All right, cool.